Thank you, Trace. For more on all this, let's bring in Senator Tom Cotton, member of the Armed Services, Banking and Intelligence Committees. He joins us now. Senator Cotton, great to have you here this morning. A lot to get to. And first, I want to put up on the screen, this is top Democrats unveiling this amendment to sanction Putin. In it, it includes this: asset freeze and visa ban against Putin, expanded sanctions against oligarchs close to Putin, banking restrictions across Russia's defense program. But, Senator, in unveiling this amendment, those top Democrats, and including Menendez himself, said that the president has proven once again that he's incapable of protecting American troops and this country. How do you respond to that?
Well, Sandra, I would say that once again, you can't trust anything the New York Times reports about Russia and Donald Trump. The New York Times has revealed why it's a national laughingstock. Remember the story they printed that the president had been briefed on definitive intelligence of Russian bounties on American troops in Afghanistan. We now know that there was no definitive intelligence. There was strong dissent within the intelligence community. A career briefer at the CIA chose not to highlight this to the president, and that there remains disagreement within the intelligence community. We also know that Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Adam Schiff have had access to this same intelligence for months, yet they haven't been taking action on it or screaming in front of the cameras until the New York Times published this story. But as far as being tough on Russia, President Trump has been far tougher on Russia than President Obama or Joe Biden ever were. They sent blankets to Ukraine, for instance. President Trump sent anti-tank missiles. President Trump has pulled out of obsolete Cold War era treaties despite Democrats objecting to it. So I have no doubt that Russia is up to no good in Afghanistan, just as they have been in Iraq and Syria and Iran and all around the world. And I'm always open to taking a tougher line on Russia. But the allegations in the New York Times are simply false, as they usually are.
Okay, so the president, it would appear that you're backing him up in calling this a hoax. You had top Democrats that walked out of that White House briefing saying what we just heard in there would not indicate that this was a hoax. And you had Mike Pompeo saying so much of this is not accurate, referencing the New York Times reporting on this. This is an incomplete picture. But he said that it's getting in the way of them really finding out the true details of this story. So isn't there more to learn here, Senator Cotton?
Sandra, what's regrettable is that someone in the intelligence community, or perhaps in a partner nation's intelligence community, decided to leak partial and incomplete intelligence. Intelligence services often get that kind of partial, incomplete, or conflicting evidence. They don't always run to the president or to a prime minister to share it with them until it's verified and corroborated, until they understand the fuller picture. And again, it is clear now from what Ambassador O'Brien has said and what others in the administration have said on matters they normally wouldn't be talking about absent these leaks, that there was strong disagreement inside of our intelligence community about whether or not this intelligence was correct or not. And as the president said, if he was briefed on intelligence that suggested there were bounties on American soldiers, then he would take action on it. That's not what happened, though, because of that disagreement. I mean, just look at, what the Democrats have done to politicize this matter. President Trump authorized the killing of Qasem Soleimani, Iran's terrorist mastermind, earlier this year, who there is no question was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans. Were the Democrats out supporting that? No, they were saying that he was going to start a war, which plainly didn't happen. They're simply using another fake story from the New York Times for political gain.
Do you support the Democrats' calls to further sanction Putin?
I'll examine legislation. I always am worried about Russia, what Russia's up to. That's why I've supported things like sending lethal weapons to Ukraine, or withdrawing from obsolete Cold War treaties, or opposing Obama-era treaties that tie our hands and give Russia and China the upper hand when it comes to our nuclear forces. I would note, every time the president takes a tough action on Russia, the Democrats who beat their chests so hard, saying that they're Russia hawks, always curl up in the fetal position. They didn't want to withdraw from those treaties. President Obama and Joe Biden didn't send lethal weapons to Ukraine. They always roll over in the Middle East, standing up for Russia's allies like Iran. It's not the Democrats are not the ones who are taking a tough line on Russia here. It's President Trump.
I want to finish off by asking you about this debate that is happening, and in some case bipartisan calls to rename some of these military bases tied to figures from the Confederacy. Chuck Schumer on this last night on the House Armed Services Committee passing this bill, forcing the Pentagon to change the names of some of these military bases within the next year. The president is threatening to veto the annual Senate defense bill if it includes the renaming of some of those bases. Here's Chuck Schumer on that.
President Trump will not veto a bill that contains pay raises for our troops and crucial support for our military. This is nothing but typical bluster from President Trump. The NDAA will pass, and we will scrub from our military bases the names of men who fought for the Confederacy and took up arms against our country.
Mitch McConnell has spoken out against the president's threat to veto that bill. He says, I would hope the president really wouldn't veto the bill over that issue. Do you support the president's threat to do so?
Sandra, Chuck Schumer is misleading about what the Senate bill would do. We're debating this very measure, an amendment by Elizabeth Warren. It is far more radical and far more sweeping than a handful of bases. It would require the ripping down of war memorials to dead soldiers from the Confederacy in Arlington National Cemetery or Fort Bragg, potentially other cemeteries as well, desecrating our cemeteries. It would require removing artifacts and exhibits from military museums. It would require the removal of paintings of battle scenes of the Civil War from West Point and other military installations. That is a sweeping proposal that is little more than historical vandalism. I don't think the president will have to act on that veto threat. I hope he will not, because I want to change that legislation to ensure that we don't take such radical steps. Chuck Schumer is misleading about the scope of that amendment.
Before I let you go, where is there common ground? Do you believe that some of those military bases should be renamed?
So what I think, Sandra, I think we ought to take the time in a deliberate and thorough fashion to study the question. I think we ought to get the input of the soldiers who have served at those bases, the veterans. These bases go back 80 to 100 years. Generations of soldiers have served there, many of them not even knowing the origin of the names. But if Fort Bragg and Fort Benning are going to be changed, then we need to look at changing things like Yale University as well, named after a notorious slave trader. Now, I know that the alumni of Fort Benning may not have TV shows and verified Twitter accounts and be donors to Democratic politicians, but their opinions, their thoughts ought to be taken into account just as much as the alumni of Yale University. These names have been around for 80 to 100 years. We have the time to take surveys, to do focus groups, to sit down and listen to the soldiers and the veterans who have served at these bases before we make a rushed decision.
I know I've spoken to retired four-star General Jack Keane on this issue. He shares a similar sentiment. He understands the calls to change the names of some of these bases, but also understands that so many lives and so many service members' families are tied to the names of those bases as well. Senator Tom Cotton, thanks for being here this morning.